And now you all have to click on the little button that you got what I just said so that we can continue. So welcome again, everybody, to our last event of our event series, Roots of Resistance. Maybe a few words for those who haven't participated yet and who are not aware of what this series is about in general, or the background of why we wanted to do this, is that we realized that in a lot of movements, especially in Europe, or in white movements also in Europe, there is a strong wish to make anti-colonialism, anti-racism, and internationalism a bigger topic in their organizing. And Ende Gelände is no exception in that. We have decided to put gas or anti-gas and neocolonialism and anti-colonialism at the forefront of our organizing and our activism. This was a decision that was taken this year because we are very much aware of the colonial continuities that come with gas extractivism, which is just the cause or the origin, the reason why it can be sold to Europe as clean or now as freedom energy, because most of the harm and most of the destruction is not happening in our backyards, but it's our corporations and our governments and our banks who are financing them. But in this process of wanting to do that, we also realize that as white dominated and often Eurocentric movements, we are rather not the experts on how this can actually look like. And this was is a very necessary but humbling experience, or a necessary realization in a way, that makes it possible to open up learning spaces and transformation spaces. And this is what we intended with this series, that we open up and learn from other struggles, and so that we can transform and truly become movements that are rooted in solidarity instead of alienation. And so this is, especially it's called Roots of Resistance, learning from frontline struggles. So especially learning from frontline struggles, meaning from people who are literally at the front lines of the fight against extractivism. And this series in particular is very important and very dear to me as well. So thank you also to everyone who's speaking and who has organized this, this part of the event. Because if we truly want to become internationally organized and stand in solidarity, we need to be aware that this is going to touch power. And this is what the industry, and the fracking industry is no exception, is most afraid of. As a report that was published in 2015 showed, done by the industry, showed that actually networking and direct action is what the industry is most afraid of. So we are on this way that is making power tremble, which is good, but which also will mean, and something that is happening already, that also in Europe or in the global north, repercussions for activism or the fight for life are on the rise. We can see that in the UK, also in Germany and in other countries as well. And we need to be aware as well that for a lot of other people, this is already the case, that their activism or the fight for life, the territory and the community is heavily persecuted. It means being heavily persecuted and being murdered for this activity already. So we need to learn also how we can stand in solidarity together, so that we become strong and don't put each other into danger, actually, when we organize together. And so we have two very good speakers for this, our comrades from this extractivism industry today, to tell us about their fights and the fights of their community. And the first one to speak will be Ilan, who works for Justicia Ambiental. I hope I pronounced it more or less correctly. Friends of the Earth Mozambique, and who's the coordinator of the international side of the Say No to Gas campaign. And she's based in Cape Town. The second person who will speak is Fernando, who has collaborated and worked with several struggles on different fronts. And what is uniting these struggles is their social, community, anti-colonial and climate justice approaches. Before I give the word to Ilham, I will just tell the people what they can what they will expect from, or what they can expect, sorry, from this event. You will hear more or less 20 minutes long inputs from Ilham and Fernando. And after that, we open the floor for discussion, for questions that we truly hope to be interactional, if that's the word. So this is supposed to be a learning and an unlearning space that is supposed, or hopefully can be a transformative space for everybody. It implies listening first, of course, and we should not misunderstand listening as just being silent, but listening is a transformative process that requires a moment of silence because we need to let the other person speak. But afterwards, I hope that this can be truly transformative for you and our movements. And with that, I would give it over to Ilham, who will have the word. Thank you.
Thanks, Louisa, and thank you everyone for coming. It's always really motivating, and when you see how many people are really interested in our struggles. And I'm really excited to talk later about some of the things Louisa was saying and how we can work together. It's Louisa, not your fault, but it's Justiça Ambiental, which is Portuguese, and we're the Friends of the Earth organization in Mozambique. And we're a very small organization, and one of the elements alongside with land grabbing, deforestation, that we work on, coal, is gas. And the gas campaign, which I'll also tell you a bit about, has grown massively because the industry has just been completely devastating. So I'm going to give you some context about the industry, and which you need to understand in order to then get into the issues of militarization and resistance or non-resistance against militarization. So please tell me if I speak too fast, because I do sometimes. Okay, so the gas industry in Mozambique, in the north of the country, no gas has been extracted yet, but already thousands of people have been displaced, have lost their livelihoods, and most are living in refugee centers now. So these are the big companies here, all the monsters that you can think of. So Total is leading one of the biggest projects, Eni, ExxonMobil, Gulp, the Chinese National Petroleum Corporation, and pretty much every northern state is financing it as well. So if you're interested, we've got a website that's coming up next week. So if you go to stopmozgas.org, I'll write it in the thing, then you'll see a whole list of all the players who are involved, the contractors, the financiers, and you can also see who's in your country. So these companies found gas 10 years ago, found gas, and since then it's a $50 billion industry. And since then, in order for Total to build they're all offshore projects, but for Total to build the facilities onshore, they've moved 550 families. So villages that were in the way were just razed to the ground. So these are farming communities, fishing communities who've now been moved many kilometers from the sea, so they can't fish anymore. And Total moved them to a replacement village. And what they would do is bring a bus every day at like 3 p.m., take fishing people to the sea. But that's not how it works. The fish don't go, it's 3 p.m., let's go get caught. That's not how fishing works. So people and farming communities they'd received about a tenth of the land that they originally had. So people were living off food aid, basically, from Total. And there was a massive attack in Palma, which is the closest village, in the biggest village in the gas region last year. And Total claimed force majeure, which means it paused its project and it pulled out. But it also meant that it stopped giving compensation payments to people who it was compensating. And it also meant it stopped all its stopped paying all the small businesses, all the contractors that were working for it. So they up and left, and people are now in refugee centers that are being supported by US aid. And so it looks like a refugee center anywhere in Africa, could be in Sudan, it could be in Yemen. It's there are about 800,000 refugees now. And these refugees have also been created by a war that has been fueled by this industry. So if you Google Cabo Delgado, which is the northern province, if you Google Cabo Delgado, what comes up is either gas or war. And this conflict that's been fueled, it started in 2017, which is when Total kind of showed its face. And people, like communities, always said, it's really weird how suddenly this insurgency happened when Total started coming. There was always, Cabo Delgado it's a very poor, very neglected province. It's a very political province. It's where Frelimo was born, the ruling party. And there's always been slight hostilities. It's also a majority Muslim province. There's always been slight tension between Muslim and Christian communities, but since the gas industry came, it's exploded. So in 2017, these insurgent attacks started happening, and we specifically refer to them as insurgents and not Islamic insurgents or jihadists or ISIS, because since the beginning, the government and the industry referred to them as this. And it was quite a cheap tactic, So Total does this thing where it places itself in areas of conflict. So if you look at Yemen, where it has a private Saudi prison in its site, in Mali, in the Sahel, in Myanmar, because what this often means is that when there is a conflict, and where fossil fuels go, conflict follows. When there is a conflict, they can blame it on terrorism. So on the border with Tanzania, where Cabo Delgado is, it's very easy to say this was ISIS or the Muslim Brotherhood or Al-Shabaab that came in to do this. But it was always a faceless insurgency. People would never, always felt that this was just very convenient. So what happened then was so this insurgency started, and people's heads were being cut off, communities were being attacked. It was extremely and remains extremely violent. And Total refuses to take responsibility. They refuse to acknowledge that the industry has played a massive part in this. And this also, goes to just the general gas industry in Mozambique, and in so many other places, is nobody wants to take responsibility. So Total has built this onshore park, which has created the displacement of people. Yet ExxonMobil, Eni, all the finances, all the banks, none of them want to take any responsibility. So it's the same that we're seeing with the violence. However, the government brought in military to defend the Total site from the insurgents. These military then extorted people for their compensation money. There was mass sexual assault of women in families, where they would blackmail families and saying, if you don't give us our compensation money, we'll sexually assault the women in your family. And the government, knowing this, Total and ExxonMobil paid the government extra to deploy more soldiers just to protect them. So when they say that they're, not linked to this violence, it's just bullshit. And so that is the issue with it's a massively dangerous situation, and people are absolutely terrified to talk. So journalists have been arrested or disappeared. There's a journalist who disappeared a year and a bit ago, Ibrahimo, and he was from a community station, and he said that the government was coming soldiers were walking towards him, and then his phone went off and he's not been seen. And this is what's happening. Journalists, activists are just disappearing. And when Total and when Exxon and Swedish pension funds and, all these European governments who talk about how human rights and sexual violence, are so important, and media freedom is so important, when it actually comes to people being completely screwed over in the global south, in countries that they're benefiting from, then suddenly they have no responsibility, right? So what the government, do I have a bit more time?
Yeah, a lot,
Okay.
so go ahead.
Okay. So what Total did with, okay, sorry, let me just go back. So yes, so journalists have been disappearing, activists, and there's now a law that's going through Parliament, which will mean, and it's amendment to the terrorism law, or that's not the exact name of the law, but that's the issue, which would mean that anyone who speaks about terrorism or any terror attacks could be arrested. So this means a lot for the media. It also means a lot for activists, especially activists like us who are fighting not just for the communities and the basic, things like being displaced and losing their livelihoods, getting their compensation, but also being able to actually take this issue to an international level, to be able to take it to courts, to be able to take it to parliament in different countries. And when communities are absolutely terrified to talk, it is very difficult for journalists to get that information to then take to the outside world. So what we often hear from, if we try and talk to companies, and when I say talk, we don't sit at the table, like it's not a negotiation or a dialogue, it's very much an interrogation. And when we sit, and we do have to talk to these people, because if there's any action that needs to be taken, or when there's action, they can't say that they didn't know. And so this is why, one of the reasons why we do this as part of the campaign. But what we do is that we work really closely in and with communities on the ground. And we're one of the only organizations that does that, because unfortunately in Mozambique, like in many places in Africa where fossil fuel companies are, much of civil society is paid by government or by industry. And we're one of the only organizations that aren't. But this also means that we're seen as quite radical in Mozambique by the government, because we're getting information that they don't want people to get. But this also means that as the organization, we're also constantly under threat. So me living in Cape Town as the coordinator of the international part of the campaign also is a lot safer for everybody involved. So these are things that we have to think about all the time. And now with them trying to make these laws more strict, just working as civil society, trying to get this information out is going to be extremely, extremely hard. And yeah, so, I mean, ultimately, yes, we have a hard time with, my colleagues in Mozambique who get death threats and threats on social media, but I'm a lot more comfortable in my study in Cape Town, right? But the people on the ground literally just telling us anything means that they are at risk of being assaulted the next day or disappearing. So it's a really bad situation. And what Total's done now, or what the government has done now, is they've brought in the Rwandan army, and Total and Rwanda and France have been a triangle for a very long time. And it's a very interesting dynamic, because the Rwandan army are seen as quite sort of civilized. They have a really good complaint mechanism. If there are any issues, if people have been affected by anything, or by the violence, they would go and lay a complaint with the Rwandan soldiers. They have good systems of recording, of documenting and recording, but they don't get their intel from nowhere. They get their intel from the Mozambican military, which is completely rogue. So this is another sort of example of a proxy army, like a proxy war. And Total does this where it's using the Rwandan army to fight its dirty battles while still looking really good. So I know I'm speaking a lot about Total when it's a lot more companies that are involved, but they are leading one of the projects, and it's also really important, I think, they're a good example of, you know, how much the fossil fuel industry is actually embedded into violence and war in this area. And then, sorry, I had a few notes. So I think it's one of the things that we're constantly having to deal with when we talk to these guys, to financiers and pension funds and companies and banks, is, you know, Mozambique has a history of intense corruption. So just a few years ago, there was the secret debt scandal, where Mozambique was exposed for having taken a $2 billion illegal loan from Credit Suisse and VTB Bank, which is a Russian bank. And they used this money to buy arms, which they then are using for the army to protect Total. So they used the money for that, and they had promised to pay the money back to the banks in gas revenue. This was all over the news by the time that these companies had signed all their concession agreements and all the financiers had signed the agreements. So it was well known that corruption was rife and that this money was not going to go into benefiting people. It had also the country was in massive debt now. And if there's any revenue from this, it would be going into covering this debt. So these companies, knowing this, still went ahead and invested. And by continuing to invest in a country that is corrupt, you are merely enabling and rewarding corruption. So what they say often in response is, but Africa is corrupt, or, you know, we can't tell them what to do because of sovereignty. And they basically have created, or we've done what we've needed to according to Mozambican law. Now it's not our problem what they do with the money. But it's the system of colonialism that northern countries have created and that they are now benefiting from. So the idea of not having control over a country like Mozambique, which was colonized by Portugal, the idea of not having control over that, which has now moved to, you know, they've taken it to the extreme of we can't tell them what to do at all. And then the other one is, you know, getting these countries into so much debt. There's so much historical debt that has not yet been wiped off, that they're still using, for like the IMF, for example, or the World Bank is still making basically countries take loans, which they then have to, but then they have to subsidize them with, sorry, I'm confusing myself a bit, so I'm actually just going to stop the point. But what I'm trying to say is that the system that people have been put into, that African countries and like Mozambique have been put into, is something that they now take advantage of. And countries don't corrupt themselves. So you can't have a dance between a global South government and a northern state or northern company. You can't have a dance between them when the company owns the hall and the music and the speakers. You know, there's this power dynamic that still needs to be addressed. So so this industry is a monster. We're at a really good point now, because Total, because it's claimed it's force majeure, financiers have an opportunity legally to be able to reassess their financing. So there's a lot of pressure that we need to put on over the next few months to push our governments and companies in our countries to divest while there's still this big opening. So I know there was a lot, and I hope it wasn't confusing or all over the place. But I think that's it for me for now.
Thank you, Ilan. That was really a whole package, and you said a lot of very, very interesting and interesting things. Thank you. And it was not confusing. I think the entire system of extractivism is extremely complex, and that is what we just need to tackle, because we need to realize how complex the mechanisms are. Complex and in a way also simplistic. No, if you just say, well, here's so it's just this contradiction that we have to work through. So thank you very much. I will for now give the word to Fernando, and afterwards we will open the discussion for all the questions that you might already have. Fernando is now going to speak in Spanish, if I'm not mistaken, not if I'm right, Fernando. Okay, so everybody who does not understand Spanish, you have now to choose English, I think, on the interpretation, so that you will understand what Fernando is saying. Fernando, floor is yours.
Ok, muchas gracias. Espero se me pueda entender porque ahorita tengo COVID, entonces no estoy tan bien de la voz, entonces espero la interpretación me pueda entender. Igual voy a hablar un poco más despacio y fuerte. Pero bueno, yo preparé una pequeña presentación para hablarles de la lucha contra el gas, y específicamente de dos casos, de dos luchas, de dos experiencias que pasaron y que siguen pasando en el territorio o en la geografía que hoy es llamada México. Y de ahí la importancia, pues para mí, de hacerlas visibles, ¿no? Entonces, como el título lo dice, quisiera enfocarme un poco a hablarles de estas luchas, estas resistencias, como resistencias anticoloniales, que se enfrentan a los procesos extractivistas, en este caso del gas o del fracking. ¿Por qué anticoloniales? Quisiera como explicar un poco o darme a entender a qué me refiero con esto, y es que siempre, o más bien en muchos casos, en las luchas de comunidades indígenas en México, comunidades originarias, comunidades campesinas, siempre se hace presente una de estas frases que es: nuestra lucha es por la vida. Y creo que es importante entender el concepto o a qué se están refiriendo con la vida estas comunidades, porque no es solo la vida en términos biológicos o en términos sí, como de este proceso en donde solo depende del cuerpo individual, el cuerpo humano, por así decirlo, sino la lucha es ante todo por una forma de vida. ¿Y esto qué significa? Que la vida no se piensa solo en este término biológico, sino que la vida, en tanto que es una forma y un modo de ser, abarca la existencia misma de las comunidades. Entonces no solo es la vida humana, sino también es la relación que tienen todas estas personas con su cosmovisión, con sus formas de relacionarse, su tejido social, con todo lo que les rodea, con el territorio, con la tierra. Entonces de ahí la importancia de pensar o de enunciar, más bien, que la lucha por la vida es una lucha contra las lógicas coloniales y del capital, que tratan de acabar con todas estas formas de vida. Y el primer caso del que les quisiera hablar es el caso de un gasoducto, de un proyecto del Estado mexicano, en unión con empresas extranjeras, que se llama el gasoducto Sonora, en el estado de Sonora. Es un estado, un municipio al norte de México. Aquí se puede ver. Está en la frontera con Estados Unidos. Y el gasoducto Sonora es un proyecto que implica la construcción de un gasoducto. Aquí viene los datos de más de 800 kilómetros, que en realidad abarca distintas, o más bien lo dividen en distintas partes, y tiene la particularidad de que en la parte de Guaymas al Oro pasa por un territorio indígena, de una comunidad indígena que se llaman yaquis. Los yaquis viven en esta zona y el gasoducto atraviesa por los 8 pueblos o tribus, como se dicen, yaquis. Entonces, este proyecto de gasoducto inició, más bien, fue aprobado en el 2012 e iniciaron sus construcciones en el 2013. Este gasoducto, como lo mencioné hace un momento, es parte del Estado mexicano a través de la Comisión Federal de Electricidad, que es la empresa estatal de energías de México. Y lo que hace la Comisión Federal de Electricidad es dar concesiones a empresas privadas. Entonces, este gasoducto fue concesionado a Ienova, que Ienova es una filial de Sempra Energy, que es una empresa con sede en Estados Unidos. Cuando empieza la construcción del gasoducto, en las comunidades indígenas también se empiezan a organizar, principalmente en Loma de Bacún, que es uno de estos pueblos, de estos 8 pueblos de la tribu yaqui, y hay toda una serie de procesos que acontecieron a partir de que Loma de Bacún se empieza a organizar, porque empezaron a construir el gasoducto sin hacer una consulta previa a la comunidad, sin presentar estudios ambientales o de impacto ambiental, que es algo que por reglamentación o por ley se tiene que hacer antes de iniciar un proyecto en el territorio mexicano. La comunidad de Loma de Bacún entonces se organizó y empezó a tratar de detener este proyecto, porque no sabían de qué se trataba. Solo de repente un día vieron llegar a maquinaria y a constructora y empezaron a cavar por sus territorios. Entonces, ante esto, la comunidad de Loma de Bacún empezó la autoorganización y a través de una serie de aparatos legales, pues, que abogados de la misma comunidad empezaron a promover, lograron que en el 2015 se cancelara por todos estos fallos o todas estas inconformidades que había dentro de Loma de Bacún, pararan la obra, ¿no? Pero pues una de las estrategias que utilizan mucho estas empresas y el Estado mexicano es tratar de destruir o tratar de desarticular la organización desde adentro, desde las mismas comunidades. Y en este proyecto no fue la excepción, porque el Estado mexicano y estas empresas empezaron a ofrecer dinero a las comunidades, principalmente a las comunidades que estaban mucho menos informadas sobre todo el impacto. Entonces, a través del discurso del desarrollo, del discurso de les vamos a dar dinero, de esto les conviene, les vamos a dar tal o cual cosa, convencen así a los líderes tradicionales de los otros pueblos yaquis. Esto es muy fuerte y es muy importante porque es una forma, una estrategia muy sucia, muy dolorosa de destruir el tejido social de las comunidades para imponer sus proyectos bajo el discurso que ya conocemos, ¿no? De desarrollo, de mejores oportunidades, de progreso. Entonces, pasa algo muy particular en esta comunidad indígena de 8 pueblos, que es que los yaquis, a pesar de que son 8 pueblos o autónomos o independientes, se rigen todavía bajo tierras comunales. Tierras comunales es un concepto muy particular también en la ley, en la ley de México, porque es un concepto que se ha ganado por luchas de años para que se respeten territorios que son indígenas, ancestrales. Entonces, los yaquis, al regirse bajo territorios comunales, tienen una forma particular de organización, que es que todos los territorios yaquis pertenecen a todos los yaquis. Entonces, a pesar de que son 8 pueblos, no se puede hacer nada si no se llega a un consenso. Entonces, esto es particularmente interesante porque fue a través de eso, de que a pesar de que los otros pueblos, los líderes de los otros pueblos, habían aceptado el proyecto, la construcción del gasoducto, Loma de Bacún se negó a aceptarlo, y entonces, a pesar de que fueran mayoría, por decirlo, los otros pueblos, por usos y costumbres no se puede utilizar, no se puede construir el proyecto porque no hay consenso. Siempre los yaquis tienen que llegar a consenso o no pueden hacer nada en el territorio. Entonces, es en este caso que, a partir de los recursos legales que también se hicieron, que en el 2016 se logra una suspensión legal de la obra por incumplir con varios de estos procedimientos que debieron de cumplir las empresas, pero las empresas no lo acataron y entonces siguieron construyendo. En el 2016 fue un tiempo bastante fuerte en esta comunidad, porque fue el tiempo de mayor conflicto, de mayor criminalización hacia Loma de Bacún. Y el 21 de octubre del 2016, mientras se celebraba una asamblea en Loma de Bacún, gente que fue contratada por las empresas intenta ingresar, de las otras comunidades, intenta ingresar a Loma de Bacún e intenta quitar a los líderes tradicionales de Loma de Bacún para imponer otros líderes que aceptaran el proyecto. Y en esta confrontación muere una persona. Esto es como muy duro y queda muy marcado en la comunidad, porque es cuando llega la violencia, la criminalización y la lucha que los medios de comunicación y el gobierno hacen pasar como lucha interna, pero en realidad pues no es una lucha interna, porque fue el Estado mismo y las empresas quienes dividieron a toda la gente que llegó a su punto más alto. Después de estos acontecimientos, Loma de Bacum nunca dejó de luchar, y de luchar por su territorio, y de luchar por la tierra, y es así que en el 2017 vuelven a ganar otro recurso legal, en donde también paran la obra. Ante esto, otra vez, las empresas no respetan esto, y entonces los habitantes de Loma de Bacum deciden organizarse y van a desenterrar todo el gasoducto, ¿no? Porque está en construcción. Entonces lo que hacen es, toda la gente de la comunidad va al lugar donde se está construyendo y sacan toda la tubería del gasoducto. Después, es hasta el año 2019 que se para definitivamente la obra, gracias a, después de 7 años de lucha, y logra Loma de Bacum que el gasoducto no pase por el territorio indígena yaqui. Esto es una victoria a medias, porque, bueno, después voy a regresar un poco al tema de por qué es una victoria a medias. El siguiente proyecto es el proyecto integral Morelos. Morelos es otro estado que está en el centro del territorio mexicano. De hecho, aquí se puede ver en el mapa la Ciudad de México, y está un poco al sur Morelos. La comunidad de Amilcingo, bueno, el proyecto integral Morelos es un megaproyecto. ¿Y por qué es un megaproyecto? Porque abarca distintas etapas, ¿no? Una de las etapas es la construcción de un gasoducto. Otra etapa es la construcción de 2 termoeléctricas en el poblado de Huesca. Y otra etapa es la construcción de un acueducto. Y entonces, este proyecto, este megaproyecto, que también impulsó el Estado mexicano a través de empresas privadas también, en este caso, el OCNOR, Abengoa, Enegas y Bonatti, que las 3 primeras son españolas y la 4ª es italiana, es que concesionan este megaproyecto. Abarca no solo a Morelos, sino abarca 3 estados: Tlaxcala, Puebla y Morelos. El proyecto integral Morelos es, ni podemos, bueno, más bien ni me imagino cómo podemos empezar a describirlo, porque ha sido un proyecto gigantesco que ha estado lleno de violencia y criminalización desde el comienzo. Y cuando se da a conocer el proyecto, la construcción del proyecto en el 2011, al año siguiente los pueblos, principalmente de Puebla, se empiezan a organizar. Se empiezan a organizar para tratar de parar el proyecto, y al año siguiente, 2013, se empiezan a unificar varios pueblos de Tlaxcala, de Puebla y de Morelos para intentar parar el proyecto. En realidad el proyecto pasa por 68 pueblos originarios o indígenas, y los 68 pueblos están organizados. Una de las problemáticas o de los puntos que los pueblos también abordan es que tampoco se les hizo una consulta informada sobre el proyecto, y que el gasoducto va a pasar por una zona altamente volcánica. ¿Por qué? Porque el Popocatépetl es uno de los volcanes más activos y más grandes que existen en el territorio de México. y piensan, o más bien construyeron el gasoducto por zona altamente, bueno, sísmica, porque cuando el volcán hace erupción, también hace movimiento. Entonces, esto fue completamente estúpido, por no decirlo menos, porque hubo bastantes estudios de académicos que apoyaron la lucha y que hicieron estudios de impacto sobre por qué no es sensato construir, perdón, un gasoducto al lado de un volcán, pero pues lamentablemente los esfuerzos no sirvieron y el gasoducto se construyó. Las termoeléctricas, se tenían pensado construir 2 termoeléctricas de ciclo combinado en este pueblo en Huesca. Al final, gracias a la organización que también ha venido pasando desde el 2012, no se construyeron 2, se construyó una, que también va a ser complementada con un acueducto, que el acueducto va a tomar el agua del río Cuautla, y esto implica que toda esta zona, principalmente zona campesina, entonces todos los campesinos de esta zona están organizados, y también es otra de las consecuencias sociales que va a traer la creación del acueducto por la termoeléctrica. Ahora quisiera un poco hablar de la criminalización, porque creo que es como el punto más duro de estas luchas. La primera fue Fidencio Aldama, como les comentaba, en el caso de Loma de Bacún, el 1 de octubre del 2016, cuando las comunidades yaquis o más bien hay un conato de violencia, porque las comunidades que aceptaron el proyecto fueron contratadas para ese día ir a cambiar a las comunidades tradicionales de Loma de Bacún. En los conatos de violencia fallece una persona. Y esta persona que fallece era de las personas que llegaron a agredir a la comunidad de Loma de Bacún. Entonces, una semana después de esto, es detenido Fidencio Aldama. Fidencio Aldama es un compañero yaqui que era de la guardia tradicional yaqui de Loma de Bacún, y que es un compañero que desde el principio estuvo en contra de la construcción del gasoducto, y que se le acusa directamente del asesinato de esta persona. Su proceso está plagado de irregularidades, desde que gente que estaba con Fidencio Aldama ese día han declarado que Fidencio no fue, porque Fidencio no estaba en ese momento donde la persona fue asesinada, específicamente estaba en otro lado de la comunidad, porque los hechos de violencia fueron en toda la comunidad, y la guardia tradicional tiene derecho a portar arma. Y como esta persona que falleció fue asesinada con una pistola calibre 22, eso fue una prueba de que Fidencio había asesinado, pero Fidencio llevaba otra arma calibre 25. Era completamente otro calibre, y el proceso de su detención también fue completamente irregular, porque se lo llevaron sin ninguna orden de aprehensión. Solo llegaron a la comunidad, lo detuvieron, lo interrogaron y lo hicieron firmar. A los pocos, al día siguiente le hicieron firmar se me olvidó su nombre en español, pero le hicieron firmar todos los cargos que le estaban imputando, que él era culpable.
Fernando, you have 5 minutes left.
Yeah.
Tienes 5 minutos.
Sí, y el compañero Fidencio Aldama lleva desde el 2016 preso, y en el año 2018 le dieron sentencia por ese asesinato, el cual él no cometió, y le dieron una pena, una sentencia de 15 años al compañero Fidencio Aldama. Entonces, desde ese momento hay una lucha por la liberación. Por eso les comentaba que a pesar de que el gasoducto ya no va a pasar por territorio yaqui, la destrucción del tejido social, la destrucción que también dejó la obra inconclusa del gasoducto, también dañaron el territorio, y la detención del compañero Fidencio todavía no se hace justicia por ella. La criminalización 2, como también les comentaba, fue una criminalización que estuvo plagada desde el inicio de la organización de la resistencia contra el proyecto integral Morelos, porque desde el año 2013 hubo encarcelaciones, hubo amenazas, hubo detenciones, hubo secuestros de personas que estaban organizadas contra el proyecto integral Morelos, y el punto más álgido de esta criminalización fue el asesinato del compañero Samir Flores. El compañero Samir Flores era una de las personas, un vocero indígena del Congreso Nacional Indígena, y uno de los compañeros mucho más aguerridos a la lucha contra el PIM. Y fue asesinado el 20 de febrero del 2019 en su casa. Y el compañero fue bastante importante para la comunidad, porque él trabajaba en la radio comunitaria que había en la comunidad, porque él daba clases en la escuela primaria que había en la comunidad. Entonces el compañero era un referente en la comunidad de Amilcingo, y fue asesinado justamente 2 días antes de una supuesta consulta que el gobierno quería llevar a cabo para permitir que se llevara el PIM, cosa que los pueblos no querían, porque sabían que esa consulta era falsa, nada más era para justificar que el gobierno actual diera seguimiento a este proyecto. Y cuando asesinan a Samir, el presidente de México, lo que hizo fue decir que Samir no había sido asesinado por su activismo, sino que había sido asesinado por cuestiones del crimen organizado o por cuestiones de delincuencia, pero no asociándolo con su activismo. Y no sé, creo que hay muchos más detalles, pero sí, ya no tengo tiempo. Gracias.
If you want to say something conclusive, or if you have to oh, sorry, wait. Other audio. If there's something else that you would like to say, you can also take 2 more minutes. No worries.
Sí, pues que la criminalización del PIN, el PIN es un proyecto que lamentablemente el presidente de México, el actual presidente de México, había dicho que quería cancelar, porque este proyecto inició en el 2011, entonces han pasado dos gobiernos, con el gobierno actual son 3, y este gobierno actual, este presidente actual, en su campaña presidencial, dijo que era imposible que ese proyecto se llevara a cabo, porque iba a destruir a las comunidades. Y en la actualidad, el mismo gobierno actual cambió completamente su discurso y ahora dice que el proyecto Integral Morelos es un proyecto que le va a servir a las comunidades y que la gente que está en contra del proyecto son radicales de izquierda conservadores, aunque parezca una contradicción, así lo dijo literal. Y la criminalización contra el PIN sigue, a tal caso de que este mismo año también fue asesinado el compañero Francisco Vázquez, otro compañero de otra comunidad que está luchando contra el acueducto, contra que se lleven el agua del río Cuautla. Fue asesinado hace unos meses y la lucha contra el PIN, a pesar de eso, todavía continúa. Y creo que es todo lo que quiero decir.
Thank you so much, Fernando, for sharing all these stories in your story. Start my video again. Cool. So this was it from our two brilliant speakers. Thank you so much for talking about all of this. I think one important thing that I already learned, or that I already became more aware of, is especially in the context or the discourse that we are producing and reproducing in the situation with the Ukrainian war, is that we have to really highlight that this war against communities and their territories has been financed by the fossil fuel industry, not just with the Ukrainian war, right? But that has been going on for decades and centuries. So we shouldn't act so surprised, and also talk about the wars that are being fought against the communities elsewhere. Just we here in Europe, at least, we don't use the term war. But I think it's really important, in order not to reproduce this Eurocentric discourse in the Ukrainian context, to really start talking about the wars that are going on and that are being fueled and financed by the fossil fuel industry. So thank you that I was able to learn that as well already. And with that, I would open the floor for questions and comments to our audience. I want to remind everybody again to first say the language in which they will speak, and then speak slowly. And if you can and want to, the people, whether speaking or just listening, everybody who want to put their cameras on, put them on. I think it's nicer to interact when you see some faces. So everybody who wants to, just put your cameras on and feel free to ask questions. And of course, if you don't want to speak but still have a question, you can use the chat. And if not, just raise your hand either with the camera or with a little icon. And then you can ask anything you want. Yes, Aline.
I will speak in English. So thanks a lot for just two inputs. It was really moving, and it also made me furious about what is going on. I have been to Chiapas to make like a Human Rights Watch. So I've heard a lot about the strategy of like dividing communities in order to kind of get the interests of, for example, fossil fuel industry, but also a lot of other extractivists and mega projectors like this big extractivist projects. And I was wondering, Ilham, if there are similar strategies in Mozambique as well. I mean, you mentioned like this terrorist, like that there are by coincidence terrorists in the same territories where they want to extractivist things. But I was wondering, which role do like local politicians and other actors play? I don't know if I could clarify my question, but if there is a similar strategy or if it's a more openly violence against the people.
Sorry, if, just to get that right. So are you asking if there's clear political involvement?
Like kind of like also paramilitaristic structures, like if that they divide, for example, communities along from different ethnic, like for instance, like they do in Mexico sometimes, or like other, other examples of strategically kind of sue conflict, something like that.
Okay, I think I understand. So if I don't answer it, then just tell me. So thanks for that question. So there's so there has been just about the paramilitary, to give you context, there have been some mercenary groups that have come. So at the beginning was the Wagner group, which is a Russian, quite notorious Russian group, which is actually registered nowhere. They don't have headquarters and they don't have any registration. And they were in Mozambique for a while. And then a South African group called the Dyke Advisory Group was there, and they indiscriminately fired into civilians. They're not there anymore, but they're not being held accountable for anything. But what they've done, so sometimes what the political and economic elite in Mozambique is very closely linked to the fossil fuel industry. And what this means is that within communities during the sort of consultation, quote unquote, process, which was just a complete farce, there were community leaders who had been bought off by the companies. And what that meant was the community members during these consultation meetings were afraid to dissent. So when companies came, they would come with representatives came, they would come with military or police, government officials. So people would always be really afraid to actually talk about to actually dissent at these meetings. And then what they would do is bring people from another village to these meetings to then sign off a register to say that all of these people came. But one amazing thing that happened was a group of women that we were working with. In order for these meetings to be legitimate, you need a certain number of women signing off on them, and none of the women signed, so that these meetings were all totally illegitimate. And what they would do often is with the compensation, so a lot of people opted for compensation because the options for land and housing were so crap. So a lot of people opted for compensation, but these were very small amounts. But when they signed for it, Total did this thing where the people would sign in a public space, and then it was this whole ceremonious thing. But this also meant that then the military and other people could see who was getting money. So this then created a lot of hostility between the military in communities, and people became scared to talk about who has compensation and So the government influence remains very strong. And like with the corruption issues, it's the government's going to be benefiting from this. And this leads to this anger, this narrative of, I'll be quick, but like what they were saying from the beginning, how it's Islamic terrorists, it's actually where there's fossil fuels and you see people who, these people have been neglected. These people have been poor for so long. And then they see these political elites and these white men in suits coming and taking everything and making shitloads of money. It creates a lot of room for extremist narratives. And that just created a lot of discord and pain and devastation within communities. Does that kind of answer your? Okay, cool. Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an important thing also to keep in mind that there can be there's a lot of government interest into splitting movements, and that they just have also the money to do exactly that. Are there more questions from the audience? or I hope there are more, I'm supposed there are more questions, but who dares to ask them? You know, yesterday I was part of a panel where there was just one person saying, oh, I feel very nervous to ask a question because I feel that it's very stupid and very basic, so I don't want to ask them. So, and then the person asked a really good question. So really everybody, I just encourage you to just ask whatever is on your mind, or share your thoughts even, you know. We have, or show your faces. Maybe people just need a little bit of time to also digest what they just heard, you know. Otherwise, I will just, I will use the space to ask a question myself, because I was wondering, especially also to you, Ilam, for the situation in Mozambique, because you also mentioned that that was an important tool in the entire thing, the IMF, the World Bank playing a big role in it, banks playing a big role in it. And I was wondering how you include those actors actually in the protests, because I imagine it's a lot more difficult to organize actions, to organize and to specifically target finance streams, right, than it is to go to an extraction site where you have machines you can stop. So I was just wondering how, or if you could share some knowledge about the protests or the organizing that is going on against these actors, and what kind of actions you're taking against financial institutions.
Yeah, so the actions against financial institutions are so all of these players are outside of Mozambique. So in this way, the campaign is, there's a big international element of it. So the work that you know, we do with communities on the ground, that then gets taken to an international level, because we work with organizations and campaigns in the countries where these players are based. So for example, we work closely with Friends of the Earth France, because Total is there, BNP Paribas, all the big French banks, French government. We work with Italian organizations because Eni is there, and the Italian government as well, and Bonatti. And then in the UK, in the US. So all the actions that would happen, sort of, or any mobilization or direct actions would happen in those countries. And there's also like you know, there's this power that comes with being white in Europe and having a European passport, where someone from Mozambique, even I can't come to Europe and take part in a protest because I took a very long time to get a visa that I had to pay 80 euros for, and I can't risk being deported. So this is why we work really closely with people who are already working on campaigns against these companies, and sort of we support each other's work. So with regards to the finances, there's the big ones are, it's banks, and both development banks of countries and export credit agencies. And an export credit agency is basically a state arm. It's fully state owned, and it uses taxpayer money to invest in projects overseas with the idea that it will benefit that country. So the US Export Credit Agency has put $4.7 billion into Mozambique liquid natural gas, which is its biggest ever. Its biggest investment ever. And then the South African government's invested, Italian, Portuguese, UK, US, China, Japan, a lot. So with these, but then there's also pension funds, you know, so it's asset managers and pension funds as well. And this is also where people can take power, because it's people's money that goes into pension funds, right? So the way that we're addressing this is what I did in my time in Europe now is we're meeting with state finances because we have to keep telling them what's happening. And it always ends up being quite a hostile meeting with us saying to them, like, what do you actually do for a living? Like, why did I have to come all the way from South Africa to tell you about what one of your biggest investments are doing? None of them take responsibility. They all say things like, oh, well, this is such a small investment for us. And, you know, if we don't continue dialogue with the company, then they're going to, you know, somebody else might come in. By somebody else, they mean China. It's like, well, you've been having dialogue with them for so long, and clearly they don't give a shit what you have to say because they're still doing the same things. So with the states right now, what we're doing is a lot of pressuring through just sending them lots of information and meeting with them. But then we also, there's a big campaign in Denmark against the pension funds. So we work with them and in Sweden as well. So any actions that they would have against pension funds or shareholder meetings that they would attend through, which is part of the sort of company confrontation work that we do, they would share information about our campaign. That with the what we're doing now is the UK government, Friends of the Earth UK, has taken the UK government to court for financing the project with $1 billion. And this went to court last year, and there were 2 high court judges, and the one found that the financing was totally illegal. The other one found that it was legal, so we're appealing it later in the year. But if we win this, I mean, we already had one high court judge saying that state financing of this was illegal. And if we win this and the UK then pulls out, then everybody else is going to have to pull out, and it will be a domino effect. So yeah, so that's sort of and then in the Netherlands, there's going to be a parliamentary review of it, where Parliament's going to decide whether the Netherlands $1 billion financing is illegal as well. So there's a lot of legal and legislative work, which is a lot of admin, but it's a way, because they're also really, really scared. Like, we can see that these guys are very scared. And yeah, so that's a way that we're addressing the finances. It's one way, one element of the financiers that we don't have with all the companies is that people's money is there and people can actually move their money, and it's really somewhere where people can take power. Yeah, I don't know, does that help a bit?
Of course, yes. Thank you. And I have 4 questions in the chat. The first one is, I guess, addressed to both of you. And that would be, what solidarity actions can people take internationally, both against these projects and for support for activists experiencing repression? Fernando, would you like to go ahead with it, or the first one who can think of an answer to what can we do here in support for the fights?
Creo que siempre a esta pregunta no hay una respuesta única respecto a cómo accionar o cómo hacer ante tales situaciones. Creo que lo que a mí me parece importante es en primera reconocer desde dónde estamos parados. Por ejemplo, en Europa, desde dónde se está viendo, hacer un proceso de decolonización o anticolonización interno, como lo quieran llamar, que ahora creo que se utiliza mucho, pero que en realidad creo que hace falta escuchar mucho y saber desde dónde estamos parados para poder entonces tejer nuevas comunidades y tejer nuevas redes. Entonces, cuando podamos tejer esas nuevas redes, cuando podamos crear estos vínculos, creo que se puede hacer mucho más fuerte esta cercanía con las luchas en el sur global o o fuera de Occidente o de Europa. Entonces, para mí, creo que ese paso de tejer redes, de tejer luchas, es un paso como muy importante, porque cuando tejes esas redes que son fuertes, puedes accionar en distintos momentos y ante distintas situaciones, ¿no? Por eso te decía que hay distintas formas. Muchas veces pueden ser manifestaciones, puede ser hacer visibles los casos, pero otras pueden ser mucho más internas, ¿no? Mucho más entre los colectivos que están participando y que están formando parte. Y no sé, creo que eso es lo que ahorita se me viene a la mente.
Thank you. Ilan, would you like to take a stance on this question, or should we move on to the next one?
No, I definitely can. Also, just I put the information about the lawsuit, the legal case in the chat if anybody wants to see some more. So everything Fernando said, and as well as I think the one big thing is that you need to join collectives, right? There are movements working on this. There are people working on this. Okay, well, the website will be up, but aside from that, if you want to get in touch with me beforehand, I'm going to put my email address here, and then I can give you some more like concrete info. But I think like, yeah, so some of the joining collectives is good, and strengthening a collective struggle, of course, is bigger because they like to divide us, right? So there's also, I think, the narrative needs to change as well. Like when we're talking about climate change, we need to not just talk about carbon emissions and polar bears, and because it's important, but what's also really important is human beings who are losing their homes and their livelihoods, and who are, you know, being caught up in cyclones that are created by climate change, and which is affects the global south most. So when we, especially when working with communities, like in, you know, with communities we work with in South Africa, they're fishing communities and farmers who have been affected by coal mines forever, but they don't call themselves the climate movement. They're just fighting for social justice and for their land. And by saying climate movement and talking about the whales and the flora and the fauna in the sea, you are excluding so many people who are actually being affected. And this narrative needs to change about not just climate change, but also climate racism and climate justice is the one thing that I feel. And then the other is like what's happened with the Ukraine and the amount of pressure that civil society and the climate movement has put on the US and the UK to pull out of the urgency with it, to pull out of, to stop buying Russian gas. I really wish that we'd gotten that same amount of urgency, or that we get that same amount of urgency when it comes to pulling out of, like, embargoing Saudi gas, you know, or Total in Mali, or anywhere else where there's a war. You know, this is and now because they're not buying, because the US is not buying from Russia anymore, they're looking at buying from Israel. And, you know, we should be using this as an opportunity to, and also from African countries. So we should be using this as an opportunity to not just be shouting about, you know, embargoing Russian oil. It should also be about, now's the time for renewables. And, you know, let's be as urgent about everything, about other countries and other people as we are about the Ukraine. Like the amount of, and this was mentioned earlier, but, you know, linking struggles. So climate change is not separate to migration. It's not separate to land grabbing and to displacement and refugees and war. So if we could put the same amount of energy and effort into refugees who are fleeing wars created by the fossil fuel industry, and refugees from, you know, climate refugees, as is being done with Ukraine, I think that is a really important thing that needs to be done within the climate movement in Europe. Can I say one more thing? Just one more thing. So we also said earlier that the climate movement's really white, right? And there is like a real responsibility that comes with living in a northern country, I feel. And so we can't go, and people in Mozambique on the ground can't shut down the Total shareholder meeting. I don't know if you know, but 2 weeks ago, activists shut down the Total shareholder meeting. They blocked the entrance, and it had to go online, and which was pretty huge. So this is the kind of things that you need to do because you can, you know, and civil disobedience works, and they're scared of it. So it's a matter of going from solidarity to active resistance, I think.
That's a good point. Yeah, thank you. And I just want to thank Christian also for putting his video on and encourage everybody else to do the same. For example, now you would have the opportunity to do that, Lynn. Yes, nice. I expected this. So if you want to go ahead and ask a question. We can't hear you, I think. Okay, we wait a second. I think we have some technology issues. Christian, we have one more question.
Can you hear me now, maybe?
Yes. Ah, there you are. Yes.
Yes? Yeah. So my question will be in English and to either of you two. So both of you mentioned legislation that was fought for and is in principle really good, like the one about
try not to move your phone too much because the audio is not too good, so try to keep your phone close to your mouth and not move it too much.
Okay, then again, like both of you mentioned legislation that in principle sounds quite good, like the one about consensus agreements between various indigenous groups, and the one about women having to sign certain agreements, but then like the implementation of those laws, it sounded like it's really difficult to make the law count. And so my question would be regarding, for example, ecocide. Do you have hope, or do you even think it's reasonable, or it's something that should be pushed for to make ecocide a crime internationally? Or also like those national laws, how could they be, how could you use the law really and make it count? In what way could people, in what way could maybe people in the global north help making national laws be effective? Or, I don't know if it was understandable, but yeah, that's the question.
How to hold governments and the legal system accountable, basically. That would be the question, with a specific example of whether you think that the ecocide law would be something that could help already. Who would like to take a position on that or give an answer?
I'm sorry, it was not really well understood by the speakers. Could you repeat, Louise? Or
I think the question was whether the law system basically is seen as an opportunity for the global north to help implementing laws that could be of a benefit to affected communities. And one specific example of such a law would be the law against ecocide, to make ecocide illegal, basically. So if and how the global north countries can play a role in making national laws binding or international law binding, if I understood it correctly. Maybe give me a sign, Gaia, if that was more or less the thing. Yeah, okay. Yeah, Ilan, go ahead.
Hi. So I think if this is what you were saying, I don't believe that northern countries should tell southern countries what their laws should be. So the only way that who's responsible is corporations are responsible for what's happening, right? Which is why northern countries need to rein in and take control over their own companies. So right now, what we feel is that the UN binding treaty is really going to be the only way right now that this is the only way that laws can actually be implemented in countries, that companies will actually act correctly in the South, is if they're being forced to do that by the UN. So this is what we're pushing for right now, not changing the law in Mozambique, because that we're trying to stop a law coming in, which is the anti-terror law, which is the one that will stop people from being able to mention the word terror, for example. But the idea of foreign countries interfering in the legal system of a southern country is just not even on the table. Yeah, if that answers a little bit.
I think it was, if I understood you correctly, more in the sense of like making our own the rules in our own countries to the benefits of other countries. Or Kaya, would you like to add anything to make the question more clear, what you actually wanted to say? Or if not, maybe Fernando, would you like to give it a try?
Sí, tampoco me quedó tan clara la pregunta, pero creo que en términos de la lucha, creo que no hay ningún ámbito que no pueda ser utilizado. En este sentido, por ejemplo, para las luchas indígenas que se llevan a cabo en México y en América Latina, en otras partes del sur global, se utiliza mucho, por ejemplo, el convenio de la OIT, el convenio 169 de la OIT, respecto a la autodeterminación y a la libre autodeterminación de los pueblos y comunidades originarias. Entonces, por ejemplo, esta ley ha permitido hasta cierto punto dar ciertas victorias, si se pueden llamar así, o ciertos logros a luchas en el sur global. Entonces creo que sí puede haber ciertos mecanismos o se pueden buscar ciertas formas en términos de legalidad que ayuden a las luchas, pero creo que, por ejemplo, algo que se dice mucho de este lado del sur global, es que sabemos que su legalidad también no nos va a dar lo que buscamos, ¿no? Entonces, podemos utilizarla y es utilizada, pero no es lo que buscamos.
Thank you. And then I would move on to the next question, which would be Divi, a question that is going to address Fernando, and it's going to be in English.
Hello, can you hear me? Ah, yeah. I don't know if there's enough time left. I would be very interested to hear about, Fernando talked about more than 60 villages. I forgot the name of the area, who work together in their fight, so far as I understood, and I would be very interested if you like to tell us more about how did they organize more than 60 villages, how did they communicate, how did they find decisions, and so on. If you would like to talk a little bit about that, I would be very happy. Thank you.
Bueno, cabe mencionar que como trataba de contarles un poco, milenariamente estas comunidades tienen un fuerte sentido del tejido social, o tienen muy presente lo que es ser y hacer comunidad, y creo que este sentimiento y esta conciencia de trabajar en la comunidad, con la comunidad y ser comunidad, es algo que les ayuda mucho a nivel de organización contra estos megaproyectos, porque es a través de las organizaciones comunitarias que, por ejemplo, por asambleas de cada comunidad, se designan voceros que se organizan en, por ejemplo, en colectivos mucho más grandes o en frentes, ¿no? En México se utiliza mucho, o hay muchos frentes, por ejemplo, para el proyecto contra el PIM, contra el Proyecto Integral Morelos, se creó el frente de defensa, Frente de Pueblos en Defensa del Territorio, de la Tierra y el Agua de Tlaxcala, Puebla y Morelos. Y es a través de este frente que las comunidades pueden organizarse a través de elegir un vocero o a través de las prácticas tradicionales que tienen para elegir voceros que son coordinados en este frente, y este frente también realiza luego asambleas o realiza acciones, y es ahí donde se toman, por ejemplo, decisiones, más bien se vierten propuestas o propuestas de acciones a tomar que después son bajadas a las asambleas locales, y en las asambleas locales se vota o se decide, se llega a un consenso si esas acciones son tomadas o no, o de qué manera cada comunidad puede tomar un papel en esa acción, ¿no? Porque no todas las comunidades tienen la misma fuerza ni la misma cantidad de personas, o no quieren accionar de la misma manera. Entonces, es a través como de esta organización comunitaria muy fuerte que se da, porque hay unos lazos no solo políticos, entendido la política como esa forma tradicional de entender la política, sino de una política mucho más arraigada a la acción y a la lucha constante de la vida cotidiana. Entonces, por ejemplo, muchas comunidades, no solo estoy yo, sino también está mi vecino, o está mi hermana, o mi hermano. Entonces, es como estas asambleas comunitarias, estas comunidades logran tener una fuerza, una presencia muy importante dentro de la organización en la comunidad. Y creo que para mí, de ahí la importancia de escuchar y de dialogar con estos procesos de hacer, de ser y de estar con la comunidad.
Thank you. And if it's okay, I would like to take Camelia first before I come to the question of Christian. So Camelia, you can raise your hand.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll introduce myself. I'm a law student, and I'm conducting the research right now about right to say no, how this is exactly what we are speaking now. It's we can say this is concept about right to say no, when local communities can stop undesirable mining projects and so on. And this concept, we are trying to find the way how it could be implemented in legal framework in EU legislation. But also I'm having meetings with different local communities, activist movements around the world, from Africa and so on, how they could stop mining projects, if it was successful or not, and so on. I mean, I wanted just to give a few comments about what we spoke before. It's about, for example, question about how global North can help through legislation, maybe, because it's already now in how to say in process about due diligence, for example, legislation, when companies have to respect human rights when they're operating somewhere even outside of the EU, for example. And I mean, how our speakers think about this legislation. And I wanted to ask about FPIC, if it's how it's totally, I don't know, implemented or respected and so on. what you know or what you can share. And also to Ilham, she mentioned about UN, as I understand, about legislation, what you are now forcing for something. Can you little bit share about this?
Sure. Can I answer first? I need to run.
Yes.
So thanks. With regards to the due diligence legislation, so what I was talking about with the United Nations is there's currently guiding principles on business and human rights. But I mean, it's not binding. So companies can do whatever they want, and ultimately they're just guiding. But so what we're pushing for with there's a big group of organizations called the Treaty Alliance, which you can find online, and it's we're pushing for the United Nations to implement or to create binding legislation on business and human rights. And this is where we feel the due diligence legislation is lacking. So I spoke at the EU to some European Union MPs last week about how this due diligence legislation is lacking, because it's basically just like the words in there that are used that basically make it, it could be just a joke. So for example, with the free, prior, informed consent, they use, like in Mozambique, the companies ticked all the boxes for free, prior, informed consent, but it was free in that, people could say what they wanted, but actually in reality, it wasn't free because they couldn't dissent. It was started off being prior, but people were moved before it was even finished, wasn't informed because a lot of the information was in language they didn't understand. And so it wasn't really consultation. So like the idea of consent is like, a whole nother thing. But the due diligence says it only speaks about free, prior, informed consent once, which is in an annex. And it uses the word consultation, not consent. So this is one issue. And then when it speaks about climate as well, it says that governments need to be, or companies need to be compatible with Paris. And that's not good enough, right? Because so with this UK lawsuit, for example, the judge said that Paris can be interpreted. So if you're not clear on, what the Paris, on how specifically aligned with Paris it needs to be, and you just use the word compatible, then it means that it can be, misconstrued in many ways. So these are just two of the ways that the due diligence legislation is lacking. Yeah. So it has got a lot of work to do. It's not enough, because due diligence also, it's based on the assumption that these companies are going to create shit. Let's find a way to do it the least worst possible. Let's try and find a way to fix it. When actually we should be going in with a binding treaty that says you can't start this at all. People need the right to know, and people need the right to consent. And this doesn't happen. So we can't even get to the point of due diligence. Right? That was a lot, but does it make any sense?
Thank you. And Ilham, if you need to run, I would just, if you want to, you can have a second to say goodbye and maybe briefly answer the question that was in the chat, if the websites that you posted can be used on official websites such as Wikipedia or something like that as references. So that
yes, I sure it can. Yeah, again, I mean, we write quite a lot about Total, like, and other organizations link, and we speak about the campaign and link to our organization. So that's fine. I mean, there was another question there about the short-term project changes since February 24th. I think that's referring to the Mozambique gas project. But so I'm just going to answer it, assuming that it is. So the Total claimed force majeure last year when it pulled, when this massive attack happened in Palma. And but since then they haven't started. They say they're going to reassess at the end of the year. But it's because of the situation, it's just way too violent. Them to go back would be a really stupid decision. But so we don't actually know when they're going to go back. And there is one German company involved, and that is Siemens. Yeah. Thanks very much, everyone. It's really great that you are interested. And if you need any more information, just send me an email. And yeah, thanks, Engelenda and everyone for organizing. That was really great. Yeah.
Thank you, Ilam, for being here. Let's stay in touch.
Bye.
Bye-bye. So Fernando, now you have the floor is all yours. I think my internet is fucking up again. I'll just wait a second. Okay, now it's working. And so Fernando, if you want to, you can go ahead and take a stance if you like, either to Camilla's question, or I don't know if Christian, your question was also addressed to Fernando or just to Ilam. Yeah, sure. Go.
Yes. Background. I think in Germany we see ourselves as not only a movement against climate crisis, but also for climate justice. And we have learned a lot about that regarding coal. So we call a Colombian coal blood coal here nowadays. But we haven't learned anything about gas overseas so far, because until now it was only a theoretical thing to buy gas overseas. We bought it always by pipeline, and so in a long-term partnership from Russia. So everything has changed. So I engaged in a climate coalition against LNG since 4 years, because I live at the coast, but nobody didn't ever care in Germany so far. That didn't seem feasible to do because it was too expensive. And now, since February 24th, since start of the war in Ukraine, everything has changed, everything. And now people get attention for the LNG issue. And we are discussing how can we get our flats warm in the winter, but that's not the thing. I think we should learn to understand what's happening because of our demand of LNG in the world. And I investigate that every day, that I see that it happens in Canada, and also it happens in other countries, that they reopen projects. And I just wanted to know whether that happens too for you because of German demand, so that we can communicate that what we are doing here is connected to the world. That's the demand side. And also on the side of producing LNG, we are a high-tech country. In my bag, you see a machine that's used for producing LNG that was exported last year to British Columbia from one of the biggest German companies. And I think they export to everywhere in the world. And I want to know whether they export to your country too, this technology, and whether this is a link where we can work together.
Thank you. So Fernando, if you wanted to answer Christian and also Camilla's answer, and with that you would have the final word for today as well.
Creo que no entendí también la pregunta de...
The question by Camilla or by Christian?
Yeah, de Camilla, yeah.
I'm sorry, maybe for Fernando it will be more about FPIC, how it works for them.
Maybe you can clarify again what you mean by that. Maybe that's an acronym that is not widely known.
About free, prior consent.
Informed consent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, informed consent.
So how does that work in your situation? Fernando,
yeah, because
free, prior, informed consent, which would refer to the ILO 169, yeah.
Sí. Sí, de hecho, en México las empresas están obligadas a, antes de realizar un proyecto, a realizar una consulta a las comunidades o los lugares donde va a pasar o donde va a afectar el proyecto. Primero se tiene que hacer una consulta informada sobre en qué consiste el proyecto, qué se va a realizar y qué posibles consecuencias va a traer. Esto es algo que se ha utilizado desde hace varios años, que se ha hecho, pero también ha sido un arma de doble filo, principalmente en este gobierno, en el gobierno actual, que se dice ser un gobierno de izquierda, porque es a través de este discurso de la consulta que ha jugado para lograr conseguir los proyectos o lograr que pasen, que sean aceptados los proyectos que el gobierno quiere implementar. ¿Por qué lo digo? Porque, por ejemplo, en el caso del PIM, no sé si no lo mencioné tan claramente, pero justamente en el contexto del asesinato de Samir, se da días antes de la consulta que organizó el Estado mexicano, en donde se iba a informar y se iba a votar si las comunidades querían que el PIM se llevara a cabo o no. Y la trama fue de que las comunidades decidieron no participar en la consulta porque sabían que la consulta era una estrategia del Estado para justificar que el plan, que el PIM pasara. Y entonces las comunidades no aceptaron, muchas comunidades de hecho ni siquiera dejaron que las casillas para la votación se implementaran en sus comunidades, porque todas estaban de acuerdo en que no querían la consulta porque todas las comunidades estaban en contra de, y solo se lograron poner casillas de votación en los lugares alejados de las comunidades, en donde votó gente que no era de las comunidades necesariamente, sino de ciudades mucho más, bueno, las ciudades más cercanas, pero que son ya ciudades. Y fue esa población la que votó, que además tuvo la participación súper baja del 1.3% del total de gente que estaba, que se proyectó que iba a participar, y fue solo ese 1.3% que utilizó el Estado mexicano para decir que la gente había aceptado el proyecto por esta consulta. Entonces sí, sí es algo que se utilice, pero muchas veces también se utiliza como arma de doble filo. Y la segunda pregunta,
about whether you could see changes in extraction in your region after the Ukraine war due to the change of energy policy after the Ukraine invasion.
No, porque México es un país también que es altamente productor de petróleo. México tiene mucha producción petrolera y de gas. Entonces, creo que de alguna u otra forma la guerra en Ucrania no ha afectado tanto el mercado, ha afectado en otras cosas, en otros productos, al parecer, pero específicamente en la extracción de combustibles, no ha sido así, no ha cambiado.
Thank you for that. And with that, I think with that word, I think we will end the session for today. We've been in it for 2 hours, so I think it's time to rest a little. And I want to give a huge thanks to the interpreters again. So huge applause for this. I think your brains must be fried to this moment as well. So thanks a lot. Thank you everybody who listened, and thank you for everybody who raised questions. I hope this was a learning space as you expected it to be, and I think I hope you will take a lot with you and back to your communities. And I hope for Fernando and for Iklam, it was pleasant to be here as well. So thanks a lot. We will upload the stream as soon as possible to our YouTube channels. If you want to go back to anything that was said, it will be possible in the future. And thanks a lot to everybody also who organized, to organizers, to Ines, to Daniela, to Alina, and everybody else who was involved. So thank you very much, and have a good evening after this. Bye-bye. I think we can kick the rest out if we want to stay a little bit in. If there's anyone remaining, I think Kaya